Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Tyndall. I am Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, where our mission is to foster curiosity and a spirit of discovery in visitors of all ages, enhancing public understanding of and appreciation for the natural world, science, and human cultures. This mission in mind, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, The Power of Antiquity in the Making of Modern Egypt, sponsored by the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. We are delighted to have Dr. Wendy Doyen with us tonight, who will discuss the relationship between state, archaeology, and labor in 19th century Egypt, and how the power of the Egyptian state at this time was built in large part on the creation of modern antiquities land and the organization of Egyptian workers. As usual, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions anytime during the program, and our speaker will address as many as time allows at the end of the presentation. It is now indeed my pleasure to introduce Peter Dermanwelian, Barbara Bell Professor of Egyptology at Harvard University and Director of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Peter, welcome to the Zoom stage.
Thanks so much, Brenda. Delighted to be with everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are in our final lecture of our season, the spring semester, but we're already hard at work on the schedule for the fall, so stay with us. And tonight we're in for a special treat. Dr. Wendy Doyen is a historian of archaeology and modern Egypt. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in museology from the University of Washington, and a BA in linguistics and anthropology from the University of Washington. This year, she's starting a postdoctoral fellowship from the American Research Center in Egypt in Cairo to complete a book based on her doctoral research at the University of Pennsylvania. Her dissertation is called, and you have to love this title, Empire of Dust, Egyptian Archaeology and Archaeological Labor in 19th Century Egypt. She's the co-creator and media manager of Abydos Archaeology, an educational program of the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU Excavations at Abydos, where she's also an NEH grant collaborator. Her recent publications have appeared in the Journal of the American Oriental Society and in several volumes, such as Unmasking Ideology in Imperial and Colonial Archaeology, another called Histories of Egyptology, Interdisciplinary Measures, and also the British Museum Studies in Ancient Egypt and the Sudan. She also writes regularly for the Abydos Archaeology blog, which you can find at abydos.org. And with her Arabic skills, knowledge of modern Egyptian economic and social history, and her deep connections to Egyptology, she's uniquely qualified to comment on the interplay between ancient and modern Egypt and the history, both the good and the bad, of our discipline. Tonight, she's speaking on the power of antiquity in the making of modern Egypt. Wendy, welcome to the screen.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to share my work and the idea, which is at the heart of it, that the remains of ancient Egypt were powerful tools for modernizing Egypt in the 19th century and for building a new Egyptian state out of the dust and ruins of its archaeological sites. The reason this claim needs to be made at all is because the history of Egyptology and the history of modern Egypt have, for a very long time, been considered two separate questions. Most often, they are treated as two different political worlds and two different cultural histories. On the one hand, the history of Egyptology begins with Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian campaign in 1798. And on the other, modern Egypt begins with the Ottoman military commander Mehmed Ali's rise to power a few years later in 1805. In these parallel timelines, we begin and end with two conceptually different Egypts. The first one moves from Napoleon's invasion and the short-lived French occupation, 1798 to 1801, which was a military failure, but a scientific triumph. It takes us through the appearance of the famous Description de l'Egypte, the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs in 1822, and the establishment of Egyptology as a scientific discipline. This side of history marches on until we reach the so-called golden age of Egyptology in the early 20th century, which climaxes with the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun 100 years later in 1922. This is our iconic Egypt, the Egypt we know from National Geographic, popular movies, spectacular shows and exhibitions, advertising, and in many ways, the academic study of Egyptology itself, all of which feed into a Disney-esque tourism industry that often seems out of touch with historical reality. The second timeline, far less known, begins when Mehmet Ali steps into the power vacuum left behind by Napoleon's army to seize control of Egypt, which was then an outer province of the Ottoman Empire. After a violent struggle against the Mamluk princes of Egypt, their massacre in 1811 was a military triumph for Mehmet Ali, which concentrated all of their power in him as Egypt's new governor. This side of our history leads to a complete transformation of Egyptian government, earning Mehmet Ali the title of the founder or father of modern Egypt. It then takes us through the colonial period at the turn of the 20th century, and eventually to the military coup and revolution of 1952, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser and Egypt's free officers. This is our, let me go back. This is our political Egypt, the Egypt we know from modern history textbooks and occasional news stories about the Middle East or container ships getting stuck in the Suez Canal. When these two Egypts, the iconic and the political, intersect, it generally centers on the period of British colonial administration between 1882 and 1922. Here, I would like to shift our perspective to focus less on European colonialism and more on Egypt and Egyptians. Let me take you first to the old Roman town of Karanis on the ancient shoreline of Lake Meris, today's Lake Karun in the Fayum. We are going back in time 100 years or so to an American-led excavation at ancient Karanis in the late 1920s and early 30s. These film clips from the archives of the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology at the University of Michigan, which I've edited here from over an hour of archival footage, give us a fairly industrialized picture of excavation, which is more or less representative of how archaeology worked in Egypt at the time. There are around 275 Egyptians working on the dig, which costs the University of Michigan around $30,000 a year, or almost $500,000 per year in today's money. About 75 of them are skilled workmen, most of whom have traveled more than 500 kilometers from the town of Guft in the south of Egypt, or in some cases from the nearby town of El Lahoun in the Fayum, to lead the day-to-day excavation work on behalf of the American dig directors. Of those 75, 2 men by the names of Ibrahim Abdakarim and El Hawi Ali Alian, the ones we see walking around brandishing sticks, act as foremen, organizing the local labor for excavation. The rest are trained excavators who handle the detailed work of uncovering each level or layer of archaeological remains. In addition, there are just over 200 young men, women, and boys who carry dirt away from the excavated areas to dumping sites. These young workers come from 12 different villages around the ancient town site, which they called Komoshim. I should note that except for isolated regions like the Fayum and a few other pockets of northern Egypt, women and girls did not normally participate in excavation. The excavation tools they are using are very basic. Handmade field hoes with wooden handles and metal blades, and baskets made from the leaves of palm trees, essentially the same tools in use on Egyptian excavations today. However, There is also a light railway system installed at Karanis, which at full capacity in 1926 was hauling away up to 400 tons of unsifted ancient dirt each day to be used as fertilizer for nearby agricultural land. The agricultural land here was owned by the Egyptian state and at the time leased by an Italian company who owned the rights to the fertilizer in exchange for helping to remove it. The antiquities land at Karanis was also owned by the state and leased to the University of Michigan in exchange for excavating, documenting, and publishing the site at an enormous cost of more than $300,000 over 10 years, from 1925 to 1935, which would amount to at least a $5 million investment today. For their labor in getting the dirt out of the ancient mound and into the rail cars, the youngest Egyptians earned about 3 piastres a day, and the skilled men between 6 to 18 piastres, plus benefits, depending on their experience and skill level. Of the money spent in Egypt, not including foreign salaries, more than half went to the cost of Egyptian labor. So how did we get here? Who built this system, and how exactly did Egypt come to support one of the largest and continuously operating labor markets for archaeological excavation in the world? Whereas Europeans take most of the credit for our knowledge of ancient Egypt, the history of modern Egypt in the 19th century is generally known for 3 things: cotton, one of the most important international markets in the history of global trade, of which Egypt was for a time the 5th largest producer in the world. Also, for having amassed, at a terrible cost in human lives, a huge army of Egyptian soldiers from the countryside, which conquered the Sudan and extended Egypt's borders into the Middle East, even annexing Syria and beating the Ottoman Sultan's own army back to Istanbul by 1840. And for building one of the marvels of modern engineering, the Suez Canal, also at a profound cost in Egyptian lives. But strangely enough, the rediscovery of ancient Egypt is not one of the things its modern rulers, the Khedives or viceroys of late Ottoman Egypt, are known for. Given that the political territory of Egypt was and is the common ground in and around which all kinds of Egyptology and its ideas were developed, how is this possible? Well, I think we've been wrong about this, that much more than a story of European discovery and enlightenment, the uncovering of Egypt's antiquity was a driving factor in its modernization by the Mehmet Ali dynasty during the 80 years between the French occupation of 1798 and British occupation in 1882 and beyond. Ancient Egypt was central to modern Egyptian state building in at least 3 ways. First, through the creation of a national landscape of antiquities, which reactivated the memory of ancient Egypt as a unified cultural space where one had not existed for many centuries. Second, through the control of Egyptian labor to excavate and thereby reclaim this antiquities land for the use of the new Egyptian state. And third, through the use of ancient Egypt's cultural prestige to Egyptianize the ruling dynasty, for example, as a political entity separate from the Ottoman Empire. This was all part and parcel of the Mehmet Ali dynasty's grand vision for a modernized Egypt that would be a major player on the world stage. Beginning in the Reform era of 1810 to 1850, and continuing through a period of cultural revival in the second half of the 19th century, the vision of Mehmet Ali and his successors, in particular his sons Ibrahim and Said Pasha and grandson Khedive Ismail, was in large part based on military modernization and conquest, and the building of a new empire that was powerful enough to rival the Ottoman Empire. But it was also much more than this. The viceroys knew that to bring Egypt into the modern world system, meant building a strong network of economic and cultural exchange with Europe. And they did everything in their power to make this happen. They sent Egyptian student missions to Paris to import Western science, medicine, and technology, and they set up schools and scientific institutes in Cairo to disseminate this knowledge and participate in these global networks of exchange. Mehmet Ali saw education as the key to modernization, and he had a keen sense of the prestige value of the sciences for increasing his ruling power. He and his successors established not only government schools, libraries, and a printing press, but also a series of state-sponsored institutes for basic scientific research. These included a new Egyptian Institute for the Natural Sciences in 1859, which was modeled on the older Napoleonic Institut d'Egypte, but with a more cosmopolitan and far-reaching scope of vision, as well as an Egyptian Antiquities Service in 1858, the first National Museum of Antiquities in 1863, and a Royal Geographic Society in 1875, which was active in the exploration of Africa and the Sudan. French served as one of the languages of Egypt's cultural elite, and many French scientists and engineers were heavily involved in the administration of Egypt's cultural institutions. But many Egyptians trained on the student missions to France, such as Sheikh Rifat al-Tahtawi, were even more influential in the educational reforms of this period. Tahtawi brought a blend of Islamic and European ideas to the creation of Egypt's first secular education system. And having a scholarly interest in the history of ancient Egypt, he also drew attention to the importance of preserving Egyptian antiquities in Egypt. He was influential in the creation of the first antiquities law of 1835 and was briefly in charge of the first state collection of antiquities in Cairo around the same time. In addition to modernizing the army and education system, over the course of the century, the new state built approximately 1,200 miles of railway, 9,500 miles of telegraph lines, and 8,400 miles of irrigation canals, plus a postal service, roads, bridges, and factories that unified Egyptian territory and brought the central government into people's lives in ways that were unimaginable at the start of the century. Under the Khedives, Egypt was becoming less and less a remote province of the Ottoman Empire and more like something that resembled a modern nation. But there was one change above all that was felt strongly by the Egyptian people, as Mehmet Ali restructured the entire basis of Egypt's agricultural economy, and with it, the material relations of Egyptian society to compete on the world market. Before Napoleon's arrival in the 18th century, Egypt was a decentralized collection of what were called tax farms, basically a complex patchwork of sub-provinces and agricultural districts that were run by officers and soldiers of various ranks under Egypt's Mamluk governors and on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. After Mehmet Ali's seizure of power, early in the 19th century, Egypt's agricultural lands were centralized into a semi-industrial plantation economy run by the Pasha's military and household government. A huge percentage of agricultural land was transformed into cotton plantations, along with a few other crops, and for a while, the state held a monopoly on cotton production and export. In addition, an indigenous system of organizing labor for local public works projects, such as dams and irrigation canals, was expanded by the central government into a statewide corvée, which forced many thousands of rural Egyptians to build large-scale infrastructure projects, major canals, roads, bridges, railways, and factories, for example. In the early years of rapid agricultural expansion, there were up to 500,000 corvée workers per year on these projects, out of a population of maybe 5 million, so roughly 1 in 10 people. And by mid-century, the state was still calling up tens of thousands of Egyptians to work every month. Clearly, Egypt's new modernizing dynasty was not built on military conquest alone. On the contrary, the Khedives invested huge sums from the state treasury into social and cultural reforms as well. And the exploitation of Egypt's vast landscape of antiquities lying more or less fallow in the background of everyday life were at the top of their list. Two key aspects of their 19th century antiquities reform were the creation of antiquities land belonging to the state, which grew into something like a network of archaeological preserves, or what we might think of as national parks, except that in Egypt, these were established for the benefit of tourism and economic development, rather than for the enjoyment or direct benefit of the Egyptian people. And the organization of Egyptian labor as a key commodity and state asset in this emerging archaeological economy and its tourist industry. A few legal and institutional reforms had already begun to bring antiquities under state control in the 1830s, such as the first abortive attempt to regulate the export of antiquities and to create a state collection at the Citadel. And some of Egypt's ancient monuments had been repurposed by the government as warehouses, grain silos, and building material for government factories. But the creation of official state-owned antiquities land began later, with the clearance or total excavation of 10 of the grandest surviving pharaonic temples of Upper Egypt. The first attempt at these temple clearances began with the Temple of Dendera in 1845, but this temple would take 30 years and the support of 3 different viceroys to finally complete. Ultimately, though, this reclamation of ancient Egyptian temples from the sand was the beginning of a modernization project every bit as central to the Egyptian state building as the Army or Suez Canal. Egypt's temple reclamation project began in earnest here at the Temple of Edfu in 1858 and 59, when Said Pasha established the first official Egyptian antiquities service and brought the machine of corvée labor into archaeological operation. Before the arrival of the antiquities service, Edfu Temple was home to a large village of around 100 households. As was common to these ancient temples, the village of Edfu was built on top of the remains of earlier settlements, often going back to late antiquity, which had filled in and buried most of the temple's original architecture and raised the modern ground level close to the tops of the ancient walls, columns, and rooftop terraces. The clearing and reclaiming of Edfu Temple from its modern inhabitants was the single largest archaeological project Egypt has ever undertaken. Under a system of Turkish military officers, local sheikhs, and labor foremen called raises, plus the first director of antiquities, the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, and his inspectors, the viceroy ordered an army of 5,000 Egyptian farmers to dig out the temple, move its houses, families, livestock, and mosques out of the temple and onto nearby parcels of land. With his Khedival decree of 1858, Said Pasha had officially turned all Egyptian land where antiquities were present into one vast royal estate with a monopoly on excavation. Over the next 50 years, the same process was repeated at pharaonic temples all over Upper Egypt, which were gradually cleared out, copied for publication, and opened for tourism, but on a much smaller scale than Edfu. For just 5 more years, between 1860 and 65, Said and his successor, Khedive Ismail, granted smaller corvée workforces, between 50 to 500 people, for the clearance of temples at Karnak, Abydos, Medinet Habu, and Dendera, as well as for excavations at other sites in the northern delta, Saqqara and the Memphite necropolis, Luxor and ancient Thebes, and in Middle Egypt. After 1865, archaeological corvée was ended, and the Antiquities Service began contracting wage labor out of its annual state budget. As a consequence, the scale of state-sponsored excavations shrank, and in contrast to the first few temple reclamations, the clearing of additional temples at Luxor, Komombo, Deir el-Bahri, Philae, and ongoing work at Karnak and Medinet Habu proceeded very slowly. For example, in 1896 and 97, when the Temple of Medinet Habu was finally nearing completion after almost 40 years of small-scale clearances, the government resumed its excavations at Karnak Temple on the opposite side of the Nile in Luxor. This temple, which is the largest surviving ancient monument in all of Egypt, would take another 20 years of comprehensive excavation, architectural stabilization, and documentation to achieve the state experienced by tourists today. After the devastating collapse of its famous hypostyle hall in 1899, the work of rebuilding Karnak Temple was, like Edfu or the Suez Canal, another one of Egypt's great and expensive feats of modern engineering and labor power. Year after year, a whole generation of Egyptian site foremen and their work crews pumped over 92,000 liters of water per hour out of the continually flooded excavation pits and raised the stone columns to their original height 14 meters above the ground, all by hand. By this point in the late 19th century, under Mariette's successor, Gaston Maspero, the Antiquities Service was forced to find other creative ways to compensate for the cost of these large-scale projects, yet keep the increasingly important tourist economy booming. They did this with almost no involvement from Egypt's British colonial administration, which cared little about antiquities, by reducing the state's excavation monopoly to Saqqara and the Memphite necropolis, where, at the same time as the temples of Upper Egypt, no fewer than 5 of Egypt's major Old and Middle Kingdom pyramid sites were also excavated and opened for tourism at an equally enormous cost to the Egyptian government. They then began farming out excavation concessions, a bit like the tax farms of the old days, to both local farmers and foreign scientists to dig on antiquities land. And by replacing corvée labor with a new state asset called sabach, which is a fertilizer enriched by the kind of organic material present in archaeological deposits that had long been exploited by farmers. As a matter of economic policy, the state began regulating the sabach found on antiquities land in 1883, both in exchange for the labor to remove it and in order to claim a share of the antiquities recovered in its removal for the National Museum in Cairo. Throughout this century of modernization, it was the labor power of the Egyptian people, corvée or otherwise, and the central state's control of that power through local community leaders and foremen that was the means by which Muhammad Ali dynasty accessed ancient Egypt's cultural power and prestige. The rayas system of labor organization was a feature of 19th century Egyptian society, which linked cheap labor and high quality production, whether cotton or antiquity, for the global economy. From its origins in this early period, by the turn of the 20th century, the rayas system was transformed into something like what we saw at Kuranes. The end of the state's excavation monopoly brought increased international competition for archaeological concessions, and this competition spurred the development of more and more scientific excavation methods, such as those introduced by the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie and the American archaeologist from Harvard, George Reisner. Such specialized excavation methods, along with a huge influx of cash to pay for them, in turn spurred a greatly expanded market for specialized archaeological labor, of the kind skilled excavators from Guft were trained to fill. During this period, Egyptian wage labor claimed between half to 2/3 of the millions of dollars spent every year on large-scale excavations in Egypt and the Sudan. But this capitalist turn in Egypt's archaeological economy is another story for another lecture, one that I hope I've shown can only be told with reference to its origins in Mehmet Ali's Egypt, which uncovered the power of ancient Egypt for the world. During the first half century of Egyptian excavations, the volume of earth that was shifted and the amount of labor involved made Egypt's temple reclamations the Suez Canal of Egyptology. Both projects were initiated at the same time in 1859. Both were products of the same agricultural restructuring that remade Egyptian society under the Khedives. And both were pharaonic in their scale and ambition. With the temples, though, they were digging a great canal through time instead of space, building a channel from the past into the present. By uncovering and reunifying Egypt's ancient monuments into a modern landscape of antiquity, the viceroys not only Egyptianized their dynasty, they also opened a different kind of canal for ancient Egypt's most powerful ideas to flow from their time into ours. This is because the power of Egypt's ancient kings is inherent to their great pyramids and temples. These are monuments which essentially fossilized the ideas and political economy that built them. And by bringing them into the modern world system, Egypt's new dynasty reactivated that power and drew on it to enhance their own. The Khedives held up a mirror to the labor power of the ancient Egyptians, and in this way, they gave us the Egyptology we know today. Thank you.